Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. In today's episode, I'm sharing 8 of the most scary, true feral people encounters in the Appalachian Mountains. These creepy stories will make you think twice about going too deep into these mountains alone. But before we start, please consider subscribing and don't forget to like and share this with your friends. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Thank you all for watching. Now let's begin with these scary encounters. I was 28 when I lost my office job and had to take work with a highway maintenance crew. This was back in 2019, and honestly, I was desperate. The economy wasn't great, my apartment rent was due, and when the state offered me a spot doing night shift road repair on Interstate 77 through the Virginia mountains, I jumped on it. Good money, union benefits, and all I had to do was patch potholes and replace guardrails. Simple enough, right? I figured I'd do it for 6 months, save up some cash, then find something better. I had no idea what I was getting into out there. The crew was decent guys mostly. There was Tom, our foreman who'd been doing this for 15 years, Dave who always brought too much coffee, and a couple other guys who rotated in and out. We worked the graveyard shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., because that's when traffic was lightest on that stretch of highway. It's a remote section, no exits for about 30 miles in either direction, just mountains and trees on both sides. During the day, you might see some deer, maybe a bear if you were unlucky, but at night it was just us and the occasional trucker barreling through. The work itself wasn't bad. We'd set up our orange cones, fire up the equipment, and get to work. Mostly, it was filling potholes with hot asphalt or replacing sections of guardrail that had gotten bent up in accidents. The mountains made everything echo weird at night, but you got used to it. What I didn't get used to was how quiet it could be out there. No cell service half the time, just our radio back to dispatch, and sometimes even that got staticky. My 3rd week on the job, we were working a particularly isolated stretch around mile marker 47. It was about 1 a.m. and we were replacing a section of guardrail that had been completely mangled by some accident the week before. That's when Dave noticed them first. He was manning the warning lights, about 100 yards back, and he radioed over that there were people walking on the shoulder. Not unusual during the day, but at 1 a.m. on a mountain highway, that was weird. I looked up from the bolts I was tightening and saw them myself. A whole family walking single file along the grass shoulder. A man, woman, and 3 kids, none of them wearing shoes, which struck me as strange given how cold the nights were getting. But their clothes, that's what really caught my attention. They looked homemade, stitched together from what appeared to be blue tarps and pieces of road signs. The reflective strips from highway markers had been sewn into the fabric like some kind of decoration. The kids were dragging something behind them. As they got closer, I realized it was a deer. Fresh roadkill from that night, probably. The whole family just walked past our work zone like we weren't even there. Eyes straight ahead, moving at this steady, almost mechanical pace. The woman was carrying what looked like a baby, wrapped up in what I swear was a piece of tire tread. "Should we say something to them?" I asked Tom over the radio. "Just keep working," he said. But I could see him watching them too. I called it into dispatch. Figured they should know there were pedestrians out here, especially with kids. The dispatcher came back and told us to ignore them and keep working. Just like that. Ignore them. When I asked why, she said there were sometimes transient populations in the area and to just focus on our job. The next night we saw them again, but this time there weren't 5 of them. There were 20, all of them carrying roadkill of some kind. Raccoons, possums, another deer, even what looked like the remains of someone's dog. All walking that same steady pace, dressed in those weird patchwork clothes made from highway materials. They'd built some kind of camp in the median, and back behind the tree line where you couldn't see it from the road during the day. When our headlights swept across the area, I could make out structures, shelters made from broken guardrails, highway signs, pieces of crashed cars that had probably been left behind after accidents got cleared. The smell hit us around 2 a.m., burning rubber mixed with cooking meat. They were roasting whatever they'd collected, using tire fires for heat. The smoke drifted across the highway in these thick, chemical-smelling clouds that made your eyes water. "Tom," I said, "what the hell is going on?" Tom had been quiet most of the night, but finally he pulled me aside. "They've been out here for years," he said. "We call them the road people. They live off the highway accidents. When cars crash, they get there first, take whatever they need." "What do you mean, take whatever they need?" He was quiet for a minute. "Sometimes the ambulances show up and the victims are already processed. Missing clothes, jewelry, sometimes missing fingers where rings used to be." I thought he was messing with me until the semi jackknifed. It happened around 4 a.m., maybe 2 miles from where we were working. We heard the squealing brakes, then the crash, that horrible sound of metal twisting and glass breaking that echoes through the mountains. Tom radioed it in immediately, and we could see the truck's cab was starting to smoke. The driver was unconscious, slumped over the wheel. We grabbed our emergency kit and started running toward the wreck, but the road people got there first. I have never seen anything like it. They moved like ants, dozens of them appearing out of nowhere, working together with this impossible coordination. Some of them pulled the driver out of the cab, which was good. The thing was about to catch fire. But the others, they stripped that truck in minutes. Seats, mirrors, they were even pulling wire out from inside the dashboard, working together like they'd done this 1,000 times before. The driver came to just as we reached them. He took one look at what was happening and started screaming. Not from pain, from pure terror. He kept pointing at one of them and yelling that it had tried to take his teeth, that it had pliers in its mouth. We chased them off, but they didn't run. They just walked backward into the woods, perfectly coordinated, never turning around, carrying all their salvage with them. Walking backward like they could see behind them just as well as forward. The next day, on our way home, we found their collection site. It was about a mile off the highway, hidden in a valley between 2 ridges. Mountains of car parts, sorted by type. Hubcaps in one pile, mirrors in another, every screw and bolt organized by size. They had license plates from what looked like 40 years of accidents arranged like wallpaper on the sides of their shelters. They'd built furniture from car seats, used hoods and trunks as walls. The children had toys made from airbags and seat belts. That's when I knew this wasn't just some homeless camp. These people, or whatever they were, had been doing this for decades. 2 nights later, they approached us directly. We were working on a pothole around midnight when about 10 of them just walked up to our work zone. They didn't say anything, just pointed at our reflective safety vests, then at their children. They wanted to trade. They offered us meat, cooked, but we didn't ask what kind. The smell was all wrong, though. Too sweet, not like any animal I'd ever known. We gave them the vests. What else were we going to do? They dressed their kids in them immediately, and the children started directing traffic that wasn't there, playing highway crew in the median, mimicking our exact movements, learning our work. The last night I worked that stretch, I saw one of them actually fixing a pothole, using hot tar from somewhere, doing it right, doing it better than some of the guys on our crew. It's when Tom quit, said they were learning too much, that eventually they'd replace us, work for free, live off the road forever. I requested a transfer the next week, got assigned to city. Work, streetlights and storm drains. Much better hours, closer to home. But sometimes I still drive through that section of I-77 and I see them. More each year. All wearing reflective gear now, looking more like us than whatever they used to be. Last month I saw them directing traffic around a real accident. The cops were there, the ambulance, everything official. But the road people were there too, wearing our uniforms, doing our job, and nobody seemed to notice the difference. I don't drive that stretch at night anymore. I take the long way around, even if it adds an hour to my trip, because I keep thinking about what Tom said, that eventually they'd replace us. Looking at how organized they were, how quickly they learned, how perfectly they could mimic what we did. I think they already have. Back when I was 23, I was working part-time at this meat processing plant up in Ohio, just trying to make ends meet while I paid off my student loans. The work wasn't glamorous, mostly cleaning equipment and moving boxes around, but it paid decent for what it was. My supervisor knew I had a truck and wasn't afraid of long drives. So when this delivery job came up, he offered it to me straight away. $500 cash to drive some processing equipment down to West Virginia. For a broke college graduate, that was basically a month's worth of loan payments, so I didn't ask too many questions. The delivery was going to a family operation that ran a deer processing service for hunters. They were located way back in something called Black Fork Hollow, which honestly sounded made up to me at the time. My supervisor handed me the address and said the family had been doing business with the plant for years, always paid in cash, always on time, never any problems. The equipment I was hauling wasn't anything too crazy. Industrial grinders, bone saws, vacuum sealers, standard stuff for processing game meat. The drive started normal enough. First 4 hours were all highway, listening to podcasts and stopping for gas. But once I got into West Virginia and my GPS started directing me off the main roads, things got weird fast. The last 2 hours were all dirt roads that my GPS didn't seem to recognize properly. It kept losing signal and recalculating, telling me to turn around, then changing its mind again. I was starting to think I'd gotten completely lost when I finally saw the barn. The place looked more professional than I'd expected. It was an old barn, sure, but it had been converted properly. Concrete floors, electrical lines running to it, even what looked like a refrigeration unit on the outside. There was a hand-painted sign that read Black Fork Game Processing nailed to a post by the driveway. The family was waiting for me outside when I pulled up. 4 men, a father and 3 sons, I figured. What struck me immediately was how big they all were. Every single one of them had to be at least 6'5", maybe taller. But it wasn't just their size that felt off. They moved wrong somehow. Too quiet, too smooth, like they were concentrating really hard on each step, and none of them would look me directly in the eye, which made the whole introduction feel awkward as hell. The father did most of the talking. He had this way of speaking that was polite but distant, like he was reading from a script. His skin, and his son's skin too, had this yellowish tint to it. At first I thought maybe it was jaundice, but it looked more waxy than sickly, like old candles. We started unloading the equipment, and I have to say, they were incredibly strong. What would have taken me and 2 other guys to carry, any one of them could handle alone. But again, something felt wrong about how they moved. Too deliberate, too careful, like they were afraid they might break something if they moved naturally. The smell hit me as soon as we got the barn doors open. It was blood and raw meat, which you'd expect, but underneath that was something chemical. Sharp and acidic, like cleaning supplies mixed with something I couldn't identify. The inside of the barn was set up like you'd expect. Hanging rails, cutting tables, industrial freezers along the back wall. That's when I noticed the padlocks. Every single freezer had chains wrapped around it and was locked from the outside. Heavy-duty padlocks, the kind you'd use on a storage unit. I'd never seen anything like that in a processing facility before. When you're working with meat, you need quick access to your freezer space, but these looked like they were meant to keep something in rather than keep people out. There tears in my ears, and was meat hanging from some of the rails, and I tried not to look too closely, but some of those cuts didn't look right. I've worked around processed deer before, and these proportions were off. Too long in some places, too thick in others. But I told myself I was just being paranoid. The youngest son, who couldn't have been more than 18, kept watching me while we worked. Not just glancing over, but really staring. And he kept licking his lips, which was weird enough on its own. But when he smiled, which he tried not to do, I saw that his teeth were filed to points. All of them. Sharp, like fangs. He'd catch himself doing it and close his mouth quickly, but I saw it several times. When we finished unloading, the father pulled out a roll of cash and counted out $500. The bills were damp and smelled like copper, like old pennies, but stronger. I folded them up and stuck them in my pocket, thanking him and getting ready to leave. That's when I heard the screaming. It was coming from the woods behind the barn, and it was definitely human. Not an animal, not someone playing around, someone in serious distress. The kind of screaming that makes your blood run cold. All 4 of them turned toward the sound at exactly the same time, tilting their heads in unison like dogs hearing a whistle. Their whole demeanor changed. Their eyes got bright and focused, pupils dilated wide even though we were standing in broad daylight. Deer, the father said without taking his eyes off the tree line. Makes human sounds sometimes, throat injuries. But I could see their faces. They were excited, hungry even. This wasn't concern or curiosity. This was anticipation. The screaming came again, closer this time, and the middle son started walking toward it. Not hurrying, just walking with purpose. The father grabbed his arm and said something sharp in a language I didn't recognize. It sounded like English played backwards, all wrong syllables and harsh consonants. That's when I saw movement in the trees. People, maybe a dozen of them, moving through the woods on all fours, like animals. They were naked and pale, circling the barn, but keeping their distance. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as they got closer I could see them clearly. They had scars, surgical scars, lines across their backs, around their joints, along their throats. Some were missing pieces. One didn't have ears. Another had hands, but no fingers, just smooth palms. They moved in a coordinated way like a pack, but they kept looking toward the barn like they were waiting for permission or a signal. The family wasn't paying attention to the crawlers, but they kept positioning themselves between me and the woods, creating a barrier without making it obvious. The father walked me to my truck, his sons forming a loose line behind us. "You leave now," he said quietly. "Don't stop driving. Don't look back. Forget this place exists." As I started my engine, I saw them opening a door on the back side of the barn that I hadn't noticed before. The crawlers rushed toward it like feeding time at a zoo, eager and desperate at the same time. I drove away as fast as I could on those dirt roads, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. The family stood in their driveway until I was completely out of sight, making sure I was actually leaving. About 20 miles out, when I finally got back to paved road, I stopped to check my truck. That's when I found the human tooth in my truck bed. It was fresh, still had blood on the root. I have no idea how it got there. I stopped at the first gas station I saw, and the attendant took one look at my truck and asked if I'd been to Black Fork. When I nodded, he just shook his head. "You're lucky you left whole," he said. Told me hunters go missing in that area every season, but their bodies are never found. The family provides cheap processing, though, and doesn't ask questions about where the meat comes from. It is sad. The local police won't investigate. Too afraid, or maybe too involved. I looked into it when I got home. That family's been running the same business in the same location since the 1800s. Same reputation, same stories. Hunters still use them, but they know the rules. Never go alone, never go after dark, and always leave when you're told to leave. The $500 they paid me is still sitting in a drawer at home. I tried to spend it once, but those brown stains on the bills looked too much like dried blood. I couldn't bring myself to hand them to a cashier. I still have dreams about those crawlers sometimes, about their surgical scars and their desperate hunger. I wonder if they were customers who couldn't pay their bills, or if they were something else entirely, something worse. I can't eat venison anymore. Can't even stand the smell of it cooking. And every hunting season I find myself checking missing persons reports from that part of West Virginia. The numbers are always higher than they should be. Looking back now, I think we were all just meat to them. The only difference between me and those crawlers was that I had a truck and knew how to leave when I was told to. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed just a few minutes longer. If I'd asked too many questions or tried to look inside those padlocked freezers. I don't think I would have made it home at all. Back when I was 25, I signed up for AmeriCorps thinking I'd do something good with my life, you know? Maybe help the environment a little. I'd just gotten out of college with a degree I wasn't using and honestly needed something that felt meaningful. The pay wasn't much, but they covered housing and food, and I figured spending a year doing environmental restoration work beat sitting in some office cubicle. I grew up in Ohio, so when they assigned me to a reforestation project in eastern Kentucky, I thought it'd be like summer camp, but with a purpose. Plant some trees, help heal the land, feel good about myself. Looking back now, I should have asked more questions about why that particular site needed so many volunteers every year. The project was simple enough on paper. We were supposed to spend a week camping on this old strip mine site, planting native tree saplings to help restore what the mining companies had torn apart decades earlier. The land was completely dead, just gray dirt and poisoned streams as far as you could see, like someone had scraped the life right off the earth and left it to rot. Our supervisor, Jake, had been running these trips for years, and he seemed normal enough when we met him in town. Said the area was remote but safe, that locals sometimes used it for hunting small game. He had 4 other volunteers with him, college kids mostly, all eager to make a difference. The first thing that hit you about that place was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but wrong quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind through leaves because there weren't any leaves. Just this heavy silence that seemed to press down on everything. The air tasted metallic like old pennies, and even though it was summer, there was this chill that settled into your bones the moment you stepped out of the van. Jake set us up in a clearing about a quarter mile from the main strip min. Pit said we'd start planting the next morning when the light was better. That first day, we found footprints everywhere. Dozens of them, all bare feet, pressed deep into that gray dirt like whoever made them had been walking around for hours. The weird thing was how fresh they looked, even though Jake swore nobody lived up there anymore. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said locals sometimes came up to hunt rabbits. Made sense, I guess, though I couldn't imagine why anyone would want to hunt in that dead place, and I sure couldn't figure out why they'd be doing it barefoot. We spent the whole day digging holes and planting saplings in neat, organized rows. Back-breaking work in that hard-packed dirt, but we got maybe 200 trees in the ground before sunset. I remember feeling pretty good about it, like we were actually accomplishing something. The other volunteers were joking around, making plans for where we'd plant the next day. Normal stuff. But that night, something changed. I woke up around dawn to use the bathroom, and when I looked toward our planting area, my heart just stopped. Every single sapling we'd planted had been moved, not damaged or torn up, carefully dug out of the ground and replanted in these perfect spiral patterns. 3 different spirals, each one maybe 30 feet across, with the trees spaced exactly the same distance apart. It was like someone had spent the entire night doing precise landscaping work. Jake didn't seem surprised when we showed him. Said sometimes the locals rearrange things and we shouldn't worry about it. Just replant them in rows and keep working. So that's what we did. Spent another full day digging up those spirals and putting the trees back where they belonged. Hard work, but we figured whoever was doing it would eventually get bored and leave us alone. Wrong. Next morning, spirals again. Perfs. Act ones, even more elaborate this time. 4 different patterns, all interconnected like some kind of massive art project drawn in living trees. That's when I knew something wasn't right. This wasn't random vandalism or some locals playing pranks. This was deliberate, organized, and it had happened in complete silence while 5 people were sleeping less than 100 yards away. That second night, I made a decision that probably saved my sanity, if not my life. I was going to stay awake and see who was doing this. I told the others I couldn't sleep and would keep watch, but really I wanted to catch whoever was messing with our work. I set up in my tent with the flap cracked open, positioned so I could see the planting area clearly in the moonlight. Around 2 a.m. they came out of the mine shafts. I'm not sure how else to describe what I saw. People, maybe, but wrong in ways that made my brain refuse to process what I was looking at. Dozens of them crawling out of those black holes in the earth like they lived down there. Every one of them was covered head to toe in that gray mine dust, completely naked, moving together like they shared the same mind. They walked in perfect synchronization toward our trees, not making a sound, their movements so coordinated it looked like a dance. Their fingers were the first thing I noticed that was really wrong. Too long, with extra joints that bent in directions fingers shouldn't bend. They used those wrong hands to dig up our saplings, scooping out dirt with movements that were too fluid, too precise. And while they worked, they hummed, this low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from deep in their chests, all of them perfectly in tune. One of them was a woman, and she was pregnant. But her belly hung wrong, too low and oddly shaped, like whatever was inside wasn't quite human. As I watched, she stopped digging and just gave birth. Right there in the dirt. No pain, no expression on her face at all. The baby came out gray like the rest of them, covered in that same mine dust. And it didn't cry. Not a sound. I rubbed more dust on the baby, packed its mouth and nose with the stuff until I was sure it would suffocate. But somehow, it kept breathing, moving, its little chest rising and falling like the dust was air to it. They passed it around, each one examining it, touching it, before carrying it toward our camp. I held my breath as they approached my tent. They set the baby down right outside, maybe 3 feet from where I was lying, and just stood there. I could hear them breathing, this raspy, rattling sound like their lungs were full of coal dust. The baby started crying then, normal baby cries but muffled, like the sound was coming through cotton. After what felt like forever, they picked it up and disappeared back into the mine shafts. In the morning, Jake wouldn't let us report what had happened. When I tried to tell him about the people from the mine, he cut me off and said, "They're mining families, never left when the companies pulled out. The dust changed them. They can't leave now. They need it to survive." He looked tired when he said it, like he'd had this conversation before. We plant the trees, they arrange them however they want. Everyone's happy. That day we found more footprints. Smaller ones this time. Child-sized, but wrong. 6 toes on each foot, sometimes 7. The kids were watching us from the shaft entrances, their eyes reflecting white in the shadows like nocturnal animals. One boy, maybe 10 years old, approached me during lunch. His skin was that same gray-white as the others, his eyes milky and unfocused, breathing with that dust-filled rasp. He opened his mouth to speak, and the inside was coated with coal dust so thick it looked like black paint. When he tried to talk, only dust came out, a cloud of it that hung in the air between us. Instead of words, he drew pictures in the dirt. Trees, but growing downward with their roots reaching up, toward the sky and their branches digging down into the earth. He pointed at our trees, shook his head, then pointed at his drawing. They wanted the trees inverted, growing into the mountain instead of out of it. That night they came again. This time we all watched from our tents as they brought bones, deer, rabbit, maybe dog, and arranged them in circles around each tree. They were singing now, words in some mountain dialect none of us recognized, their voices blending together in harmonies that made my teeth ache. The pregnant woman was thin again, but I never saw what happened to her baby. The worst part was watching them eat. They scooped up handfuls of that gray dirt and consumed it like it was communion bread, passing it around and chewing with expressions of pure satisfaction. Their teeth were black with it, their lips crusted, but they kept eating like they were starving for it. We packed up and left the next morning. Couldn't finish the project. Jake said it happened every year, that they never managed to keep volunteers for the full week. The trees we planted are probably all in spirals now, he said as we drove away. Growing wrong, fed by bones, tended by the dust people. I never went back to Kentucky. Never finished my AmeriCorps service either. Couldn't handle being outdoors anymore, not after that. I work in IT now, spend my days in climate-controlled offices with fluorescent lights and filtered air. Sometimes I dream about those spiral patterns, about babies born gray and breathing dust, about trees growing roots first into poisoned earth. To this day, I can't plant anything in my yard. Can't even keep houseplants alive. Every time I see something growing, I think about those fingers with too many joints, arranging life in patterns I'll never understand, in a place where the earth itself was murdered and something else took its place. Back when I was 22, I was trying to make ends meet selling handmade jewelry at craft fairs around the Southeast. I'd dropped out of college my junior year because I couldn't afford it anymore, and I was living in a studio apartment in Asheville, working part-time at a coffee shop and making these wire-wrapped stone pendants in my spare time. The craft fair circuit was actually decent money if you could get into the right events, and I'd heard about this Mountain Heritage Festival in western North Carolina that was supposed to be huge. They had maybe 300 vendors and thousands of visitors over the weekend, all coming for authentic Appalachian crafts and mountain culture. I applied back in June and honestly didn't expect to get in, but they accepted me for their October festival. The drive up to the festival grounds took me through some of the most beautiful country I'd ever seen. Rolling mountains covered in gold and red leaves, old barns tucked into valleys, the kind of scenery that makes you understand why people never leave these mountains. The festival was being held at this historic site near Boone, with permanent buildings for demonstrations and temporary booths set up in long rows across the fields. I got there Friday morning to set up, and the organizers assigned me a spot between a potter who made these amazing glazed bowls and a woman selling what her sign called traditional mountain crafts. The potter was friendly enough, an older guy named Jim who'd been doing these festivals for 20 years. He helped me get my display table level and gave me tips about which credit card reader worked best in the mountains where cell service was spotty. But he kept glancing over at the booth on my other side with this expression I couldn't quite read. The woman running that booth had her back to us most of the time, arranging her inventory. From what I could see, she had dolls made from twisted roots and branches, some kind of bone jewelry hanging from little wooden stands, and baskets full of what looked like grass figures. "Mountain families," Jim said quietly when she walked to the back of her booth. "Been coming to these festivals longer than anyone. They make traditional crafts, real old-style mountain work, just..." He trailed off and went back to his pottery. The woman herself was probably in her 40s, with long, gray-streaked hair that she kept in a braid down her back. She wore a simple brown dress that looked handmade, and she never seemed to look directly at customers. When people asked about prices, she'd mumble numbers while keeping her eyes down. Her husband and 2 kids ran the front of the booth while she worked in the back, constantly making more of those little woven figures. The husband was tall and thin, probably mid-40s like his wife, and there was something off about his hands. All his fingers were different lengths, like they'd been broken and healed wrong. But when he demonstrated wood carving for customers, he held the knife in this backwards grip, cutting toward himself, and somehow made these perfect little sculptures that way. I'd never seen anyone use a knife like that, and it made me nervous just watching. The kids were maybe 8 and 10, both with their heads completely shaved, and that's when I noticed the scars. Geometric patterns cut into their scalps, still pink and healing, like ritual scarification. They didn't play or run around like other kids at the festival. They just stood there watching customers with these empty, serious expressions. And their cash box, I swear this is true, was made from what looked like a human skull, lacquered black and shiny. I tried to focus on my own booth, but I kept noticing things. Other vendors left gaps between their booths, and this family's at a same pace, like they didn't want to be too close. When I asked Jim about it, he just shook his head. "Mountain families," he said again. "Don't buy from them." But customers loved their work, especially these little woven figures, maybe 6 inches tall, made from hair and grass and shaped like people. They were incredibly detailed, with tiny faces and clothes, each one unique. People would pick them up and get this distant look in their eyes, then pay whatever the family asked without negotiating. I watched one woman buy a figure that looked remarkably like her, down to the same hairstyle and clothes. She held it for maybe 30 seconds, then started scratching at her arms. Not casual scratching, desperate clawing that drew blood. She couldn't seem to stop herself. The family watched her with these satisfied expressions, like they'd expected exactly that reaction. That night I was camping at the festival grounds with most of the other vendors. The organizers had set up a camping area in the woods behind the main site, and I'd brought my little 2-person tent. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of drums. Not festival drums, something deeper, more rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I lay there listening for maybe 10 minutes before curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my phone's flashlight and followed the sound deeper into the woods. I found them in a clearing about a quarter mile from the main camping area. Maybe 20 people sitting in a circle around a small fire, all working on crafts in complete silence except for that steady drum beat. The whole family was there, plus other people I hadn't seen before, all dressed in similar homemade clothes. They were making those dolls, but now I could see what they were using for materials. Hair pulled from brushes in the festival bathroom trash cans, nail clippings, used tissues, anything with DNA. They were making people, specific people, capturing something essential about each festival visitor. The woman looked up and saw me standing at the edge of the clearing. She stood smoothly, despite her ankles, ending sideways, moving like she'd done this exact motion thousands of times. She walked over carrying one of the figures, and when she held it out, my blood went cold. It looked exactly like me. Every detail perfect. The mole on my neck, the scar on my chin from when I fell off my bike as a kid, even the way I part my hair. "You keep," she said. First clear words I'd heard from her. "Or we keep." The threat was obvious. Take the doll or become part of their collection somehow. I took it and ran back to my tent, packed up everything in the dark, loaded my car as quietly as possible. But as I was putting the last box in my trunk, they appeared around my car. The whole group, each holding one of those dolls. All different people. Other festival visitors, vendors, locals. The husband pointed at my doll, then at me, then smiled. His teeth were solid gold, but not dental work. It looked like melted jewelry, rings and chains formed into tooth shapes. They let me leave, but I felt this pulling sensation the whole drive home, like invisible strings attached to my chest. I got back to Asheville and immediately threw the doll in my fireplace. Huge mistake. I woke up the next morning with burn marks exactly where the doll had burned. My hands, my arms, one across my stomach. The marks looked like they'd been there for weeks, and they won't heal. I've been to 3 different doctors, and no one can explain it. The burns don't hurt exactly, but I can feel them all the time, especially during full moons when they get warm and seem to pull toward the mountains. I found other vendors from that festival online, and we all have similar stories. Weird marks that won't heal, dolls we can't destroy or throw away, this constant feeling of being watched. We track the family online now, warning other craft fair vendors, but no one believes us. They still show up at festivals all over Appalachia, different ones each season. Mountain Heritage in the fall, spring festivals in Virginia, summer events in Tennessee. I don't do craft fairs anymore. I work at a regular job now, 40 hours a week in an office, and I've never gone back to those mountains. But sometimes, especially when the moon is full, I can feel those burns warming up, pulling me back toward whatever that family really was. Looking back now, I don't think they were entirely human. I think they were something older, something that's been in those mountains longer than we have, learning to mimic us but not quite getting it right. The doll is still in my apartment. I can't bring myself to touch it, can't throw it away, can't burn it again. It sits on a shelf in my bedroom, and sometimes I swear it moves slightly when I'm not looking directly at it. I've thought about moving across the country, but I have this feeling that distance wouldn't matter. Whatever they did to me that night, it's permanent. If you ever see vendors like that at mountain festivals, traditional crafts, bone jewelry, those little woven figures, just keep walking. Don't make eye contact. Don't touch anything they're selling, and definitely don't let them see you watching them work. Some traditions are meant to stay in the mountains, and some mountain families aren't entirely family anymore. I was 26 when I volunteered for disaster relief after those Kentucky floods back in 2021. I'd been working construction in Louisville, but honestly, the pay was garbage and I needed something that felt like it actually mattered. My buddy Jake told me about this FEMA relief program where they'd put you up in temporary housing and pay decent money to help clean up the mountain towns that got hit worst. I figured it was better than swinging a hammer for some rich developer. Plus, I'd grown up visiting my grandparents in eastern Kentucky, so I knew the area pretty well. What I didn't know was that some places shouldn't be cleaned up. Some places should just be left buried under all that mud and debris. They assigned our crew to Creek Junction, which wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road before the flood hit. Maybe 300 people lived there, tucked into this narrow valley where Copper Creek met the main river. Most folks had evacuated when the waters came. But you know how mountain people are about their land. A handful of families refused to leave, camping out in whatever buildings were still standing, determined to rebuild. I respected that, honestly. These were people whose great-great-granddaddies had settled that valley, and they weren't about to let some floodwater run them off. Our job was pretty straightforward: clear the mud and debris from Main Street, check the structural integrity of the remaining buildings, and document everything for the insurance companies. Rick Summers was our team leader, a good guy who'd been doing disaster relief for 15 years. He'd seen everything from hurricanes in Louisiana to tornadoes in Oklahoma. So when Rick told you something was off, you listened. We had 6 people total on our crew, living in those little FEMA trailers set up on higher ground about 2 miles from town. The work was hard, but honest. Shoveling mud, hauling out waterlogged furniture, sorting through what could be saved and what needed to go to the dump. The smell was awful. That dead, rotten smell that comes when a river decides to rearrange everything in its path. But we were making progress, and the locals seemed grateful for the help. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the little general store, brought us sweet tea every afternoon. Old Tom Bailey would sit on what was left of his porch and tell us stories about the town's history while we worked. That's when we found the first tunnel. We were clearing mud from in front of Bailey's hardware when my shovel hit something that wasn't ground. It made this hollow sound, like knocking on a door. Rick came over with his probe, and sure enough, there was empty space underneath. At first we figured it was just a storm drain or maybe an old sewer line that had gotten exposed. Towns that old, sometimes the infrastructure was pretty makeshift. But when we cleared away more mud, we could see it wasn't any kind of utility line. This was a tunnel, maybe 4 feet wide and just tall enough for a person to walk through if they hunched over a little. The walls were hand-carved into the rock and earth, with wooden supports that looked like they'd been there for decades. The strange thing was, it didn't follow the path a sewer would take. It curved under the buildings, heading deeper into the hillside. Rick called it in to the FEMA coordinator, and they told us to document everything. Structural integrity, you know? If there was a whole network of tunnels under the town, that could explain why some of the buildings had shifted during the flood. So we started mapping what we could see from the surface. We found tunnels everywhere. Under the post office, under the church, under half the houses that were still standing. They connected to each other in a pattern that didn't make any sense. For utilities or mining, it was like someone had spent years digging a maze under Creek Junction and the flood had finally exposed it. The locals got nervous real fast when they saw us, poking around those tunnels. Mrs. Henderson stopped bringing us sweet tea. Tom Bailey quit telling his stories and went inside whenever he saw us coming. When Rick asked him about the tunnels, Bailey just shook his head and said we should leave them alone, that they'd been there longer than anyone could remember and they weren't bothering anybody. But FEMA insisted we do our job. If the town was going to get federal money for rebuilding, they needed a full structural assessment. That included checking out whatever was underneath their feet. So Rick and I went down. The tunnel entrance behind the hardware store was the biggest and most stable looking. We had our hard hats, good flashlights, and a radio to stay in contact with the rest of the crew. Rick went first, and I followed. The air down there was different, not just cool and damp like you'd expect in a cave, but thick somehow, like breathing through wet cloth. The tunnels were older than we'd thought, way older. The wooden supports were hand-hewn with tools that looked like they were from another century. But here's the thing that got to me. They were actively used, fresh footprints in the mud that the flood had left behind, scratch marks on the walls that looked recent. Somebody had been down there recently, and not just to check for flood damage. We followed the main tunnel for maybe 50 yards before it opened up into a larger chamber. Rick played his flashlight around, and we both just stopped and stared. Someone had carved out little rooms along the walls, like cave apartments. They had furniture, old chairs and tables, wooden shelves built into the rock. And they had belongings. Children's toys from what looked like the 1950s. Newspapers from the 1970s, folded and stacked like someone had just finished reading them. Kitchen utensils, blankets, even some old photographs in frames. Everything was arranged, neat and tidy like museum displays, like someone had been taking care of this stuff for decades. Rick picked up one of the photo frames and showed it to me. It was a picture of Creek Junction, but wrong somehow. The buildings were the same, the street layout was familiar, but the people in the photo looked off. Their faces were too long, their fingers had too many joints, their eyes were set just a little too far apart. Like someone had tried to draw humans from memory but got the details wrong. That's when we heard the movement deeper in the tunnels. Splashing sounds like someone walking through shallow water. And whispers. Not words we could make out, but definitely voices having a conversation. We should have left right then. Rick had that look on his face that said we were in over our heads. But we were professionals, you know. We had a job to do. And honestly, I think we both figured it was just some of the local folks who'd taken shelter down there during the flood and hadn't come up yet. We followed the sound through a series of smaller tunnels that connected like branches on a tree. The whispers got louder, and I started to make out words, though they were in a dialect I didn't recognize. Not quite English, but close enough that I could catch pieces here and there. The tunnel opened up into a big cave room, maybe 30 feet across, and that's where we found them. There were about 30 people huddled together in the back of the cave. Flood survivors, I thought at first. Their clothes were soaked, their hair was matted with mud, and their skin had that blue-white color you get when you've been in cold water too long. Some of them were kids, clinging to what I assumed were their parents. Rick called out to them, asked if they needed help, told them we were with FEMA and could get them to safety. That's when one of the older women looked up at us. Her mouth opened and water poured out. Not a little bit. I'm talking about gallons of river water, like she was a human bucket that had just tipped over. When the water stopped, she spoke. We stayed below. We always stay below. This is our place. Her voice was wrong. Too deep. Like it was coming from somewhere else and just using her mouth to get out. And her eyes, they were milky white, like she'd been blind for years, but she was looking right at us. That's when I noticed the others. Their eyes were all like that, adapted to the dark. Our flashlights were hurting them. They kept raising their hands to block the light and making this low hissing sound. And the children, God help me, the children had these slits on their necks that opened and closed like they were breathing through them. Not gills exactly, but something that served the same purpose. Rick tried to key his radio, but one of the men reached out and took it from him. Not roughly, just firm, like a parent taking something away from a kid who shouldn't have it. No outside. Outside ends us. We stay below. The woman who'd spoken first started telling us about their history, how the original settlers had found them living in the caves when they first came to the valley, how they'd made a deal, the surface for the newcomers, the underground for the ones who'd been there first. They weren't feral or primitive. They were evolved, adapted, changed. She showed us how they could filter water through their skin, how they could see in absolute darkness, how they could hear sounds traveling through solid rock. The children could hold their breath for 20 minutes. They fed on cave fish and white crickets and mineral deposits that grew on the tunnel walls. They offered us food, pale white meat that had no taste but filled your stomach. Said if we wanted to stay, we could adapt too. Took about 5 years for the change to complete. They showed us others who'd joined them over the decades, people who'd gone missing after floods and storms, people who'd chosen to stay below instead of returning to the surface. All of them had that same blue-white skin, that same strange way of breathing, that same look of complete contentment. They let us leave, but made us promise not to tell anyone about them. Said they'd been keeping the bargain with the surface world for generations, and they expected us to do the same. We stumbled back through those tunnels in a daze, climbed up into the daylight, and just sat there for a long time trying to process what we'd seen. Rick reported structural damage from extensive tunneling, recommended the buildings be condemned. FEMA filled the tunnels with concrete the next week, sealing them up tight. But I know concrete can't stop them. They've been down there longer than anyone can remember, and they'll find a way to stay. I finished out my contract and went back to Louisville, but I kept track of the news from that area. Every time there's a flood in those mountains, a few more people go missing. Creek Junction gets a little smaller each year, but I wonder sometimes if that's because people are leaving or because they're just moving downstairs. I never went back to eastern Kentucky. I tell people it's because the work dried up, but that's not the whole truth. Sometimes, when it rains hard, I dream about those tunnels, about that woman with the milky eyes and the water pouring from her mouth, about children with gills breathing underwater in the dark. And sometimes in those dreams, I'm breathing underwater too. I was 24 when this happened, just some guy working nights at a warehouse in Columbus, trying to make enough money to maybe go back to school someday. My older brother Jake was getting married down in Charlotte, and honestly, I almost didn't go. We weren't that close anymore, and I'd already blown my vacation days that year. But my mom kept calling, saying how important it was for family to be there, so I finally gave in and asked for the weekend off. I should have flown, but I was broke and figured the drive wouldn't be too bad. My 2004 Honda Civic wasn't exactly reliable, but it had gotten me through 3 years of college and back, so I thought it could handle one more road trip. I loaded up on energy drinks and hit the road Friday night after my shift ended, figuring I'd drive through the night and get there Saturday morning with time to clean up before the ceremony. Everything was fine until I hit West Virginia. I'd been driving for about 5 hours, cruising through those winding mountain roads on Route 19, when I started noticing the temperature gauge creeping up. At first I thought maybe it was just the hills making the engine work harder, but by the time I saw steam starting to leak from under the hood, I knew I was in trouble. It was just past midnight, no cell service for the last hour, and I hadn't seen another car in probably 20 minutes. The mountains out there are just empty at night. Nothing but dark trees and the occasional reflector on the guardrail. When the steam really started pouring out, I had no choice but to pull over at this little gravel turnout next to a rusty guardrail. I sat there for a minute with the engine off, just listening to the ticking sounds as everything cooled down. That's when I first heard something moving around in the woods below the road. At first I figured it was just deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sounds were wrong, so meow. Branches snapping, but in a rhythm, like footsteps. Heavy footsteps. I cracked my window to listen better, and that's when the smell hit me. It wasn't like anything I'd smelled before. Unwashed bodies mixed with something rotten, like meat that had been sitting out in the sun too long. I quickly rolled the window back up, but the smell seemed to stick in my nose. That's when something slammed into the passenger side of my car. I jumped so hard, I hit my head on the roof. Whatever hit the door hit it hard enough to rock the whole car. Then I saw the hand pressed against the passenger window, and I knew right away something was seriously wrong with it. The fingers were too long, with too many knuckles, and the skin looked like old leather that had been left outside for years. Then the face appeared. It was human, but stretched wrong, like someone had grabbed both sides of a person's head and pulled. The skin was the same leathery texture as the hands, and the eyes were too small for the face. But the worst part was when it started licking the glass with this black tongue, leaving thick trails of saliva that looked more like oil. I sat there frozen as more faces appeared at every window. They were all wrong in different ways. Some with skin that hung loose, others with features bunched up too tight. They didn't try to break the glass or get inside. They just licked it, tasted it. Their tongues made this wet scraping sound against the windows that I can still hear when it's really quiet. One of them found my exhaust pipe and started drinking the coolant that was dripping out. Actually drinking it, making these satisfied gulping sounds. Another one was at my front wheel, and I watched in horror as it started chewing on my tire, not just biting it, actually eating chunks of rubber, swallowing them down. They were communicating with each other, but not with words. Instead, they made these rumbling sounds in their chests and clicking noises in their throats, almost like they were having a conversation. The sounds were organized, purposeful, like they were discussing something. Then I saw the child. It couldn't have been more than 10 years old, completely naked and covered in dirt and filth. It climbed right up onto my hood and smiled at me through the windshield. Its mouth was full of bloody gums. No teeth at all. Just raw, red flesh. While I watched, it grabbed one of my windshield wipers and started eating it, crunching through the rubber and metal like it was candy. The adults, if you could call them that, were watching me through the windows while the smaller ones fed on different parts of my car. They were teaching them. I could see them pointing at my headlights, my side mirrors, making those instruction sounds. The little ones would nod and move to whatever part they'd been shown. That's when the big one appeared. He was massive, probably close to 7 feet tall, covered in scars that looked like claw marks. He was holding something up for me to see, a hubcap. Then he held up another one and another. He had dozens of them, all different makes and models, strung together like some kind of trophy collection. He pointed at my wheels, then at his collection, then back at my wheels. The gesture was unmistakable. He was making me an offer. A trade. I revved my engine and they all scattered, but not far. They moved back maybe 10 feet and just stood there watching. I tried to drive away, but when I pressed the brake pedal, it went straight to the floor. Looking down, I could see brake fluid pooling under my car. They'd eaten through the brake lines. The child on my hood suddenly doubled over and vomited black liquid all over my windshield. The smell that came through my vents was like burning plastic mixed with stomach acid. That's when I realized it was my brake fluid mixed with whatever was in that thing's stomach. Then they all started vomiting. All at once, like some kind of signal had been given. The surge. I began projectile vomiting this black, oily substance all over my car. The smell made me retch. It was that chemical burn smell mixed with human waste and something else I couldn't identify. The sound was horrible, like water hitting hot metal over and over. Through my rearview mirrors, I could see more of them coming up from the valley below. Dozens of them, all carrying car parts, mirrors, antennas, license plates, pieces of bumper and trim. They moved in this organized way, like ants carrying food back to the nest. They surrounded my car and started taking it apart while I was still inside, not with tools, with their hands and teeth. They were incredibly strong, just peeling back metal like it was paper. I could hear them tearing through the body panels, crunching through the plastic trim. The windshield started cracking as one of them chewed through the seal around the edges. I grabbed my phone and ran. I just left everything, my clothes, my wallet, my brother's wedding gift, and bolted into the woods on the other side of the road. Behind me, I could hear them tearing into my car like wild animals on a carcass, but they didn't chase me. They were too interested in what they'd caught. I ran for what felt like hours through those dark woods, following what I hoped was the road. My phone was dead, no flashlight, just stumbling through trees and undergrowth until I finally saw headlights. A trucker found me on the roadside at dawn, probably looking like I'd lost my mind. He didn't believe me at first when I tried to explain what happened. Said there were a lot of meth labs in those mountains. Maybe I'd stumbled into something I shouldn't have. But when we drove back to where my car had been, his whole attitude changed. My car was gone, completely gone. There was just an oil stain where it had been and hundreds of bare footprints in the dirt around the pull-off. But what got the trucker's attention was a piece of my rear bumper they'd missed, with clear teeth marks gouged into the plastic. He went pale when he saw that and just said, "Mountain people. We don't stop on this stretch." The state police filed a report, but they called it a chop shop operation. Said criminals in the area would strip cars for parts and sell them over state lines. They didn't want to hear about anything else. My insurance company called it vandalism and wouldn't cover the total loss. My brother thought I made the whole thing up to get out of his wedding. I ended up taking a Greyhound bus to Charlotte and showed up 12 hours late, looking like I'd been hiking for days. The story I told him was that my car broke down and I had to wait for a tow truck, but I could tell he didn't believe me. That was 6 years ago, and I still take the bus everywhere. I can't stand being in a car alone, especially at night. Sometimes I'll Google missing vehicles Route 19 and find hundreds of cases. All breakdowns, all at night, all cars that were never recovered. The police always call them thefts or chop shop operations. I still wake up sometimes tasting that chemical smell, hearing the sound of them chewing through metal and rubber. My therapist says I experienced some kind of trauma during a carjacking incident, and maybe that's easier for everyone to believe. But carjackers don't eat brake lines and drink coolant. They don't have children who smile with bloody gums and teach them which parts of a car taste the best. I found a support group online, other people with stories from those mountains. We don't talk about it much, but we all lost our vehicles the same way. And we all know we're lucky that's all we lost. I was 30 when this happened, driving tour buses for Mountain View tours out of Asheville. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid decent and kept me outdoors most days. The company specialized in fall foliage tours, bringing city folks up into the mountains to see the leaves change. Most of our clients were retirees with cameras and fanny packs, sweet people who'd get excited over every red maple we passed. I'd been doing the job for 3 years and thought I'd seen everything these mountains had to offer. I was wrong. That October day started like any other. I had 12 seniors from Sunset Manor Retirement Home, all bundled up in their jackets despite it being pretty warm for the season. Betty was the unofficial group leader, this tiny 78-year-old woman with steel gray hair and bright blue eyes who kept everyone in line. She'd done this tour before and knew all the best spots for photos. The others looked up to her like she was their grandmother, which I guess she kind of was. We'd already hit our usual stops: Grandfather Mountain, the Blue Ridge Parkway overlooks, that little craft shop in Banner Elk where they always bought overpriced jam. Everyone was happy, taking pictures and chatting about their grandkids. I remember thinking it was going to be one of those easy days where nothing went wrong and everyone tipped well at the end. Around 3 p.m, we were heading back toward Asheville when my GPS started acting up. The screen kept flickering, then suddenly rerouted us off the main highway. "Scenic detour," it said, promising to save us 20 minutes. I should have known better. GPS units don't usually route tour buses down backwoods roads. But the seniors were getting restless, and Betty asked if we could take a different way back to see some new scenery. So I followed the blue line on the screen. The road started normal. Enough. Regular 2-lane blacktop winding through the hills. But after about 10 miles, it narrowed to 1 lane, then turned to gravel. I was already feeling uneasy when it became barely more than a dirt path with trees scraping the sides of the bus. My passengers were getting nervous too, asking questions I couldn't answer. "Where are we going? Is this safe? Maybe we should turn around." But there was nowhere to turn around. The path was too narrow, with thick forest on both sides and deep ditches I couldn't see the bottom of. That's when the GPS died completely. Just went black, wouldn't turn back on no matter what I tried. I kept driving because I didn't have much choice. Had to be a way out eventually, right? These old logging roads all connected to something. I told my passengers we'd be fine, that I'd driven worse roads than this, but honestly, I was starting to sweat. We came around a sharp blind curve, and there they were. 20 people standing in the middle of the road, just standing there like they were waiting for a bus. All ages, kids, adults, elderly folks, all completely naked, all covered head to toe in what looked like white mud or clay, painted on thick like body paint. They weren't moving, just staring at our bus like they'd never seen anything like it before. I hit the brakes and honked the horn, expecting them to scatter. Instead, they started walking toward us, slow, curious steps, tilting their heads like they were studying some fascinating new creature. Behind me, my passengers started making worried noises. "What are they doing? Why aren't they wearing clothes? Frank, what's going on?" The people reached the bus and began touching it, running their hands along the sides, pressing their faces against the windows. Their skin was pale underneath the white mud, and their eyes were completely normal. Human eyes, alert and intelligent. T had somehow made it worse. If they'd looked crazy or sick, maybe I could have understood it. But they looked like regular people who just happened to be naked and painted white standing in the middle of nowhere. One of the children, maybe 8 or 9 years old, climbed up onto the hood and then the windshield. He pressed his face against the glass, looking right at me with these curious, bright eyes. His little hand left white smudges on the windshield as he peered into the bus. My passengers were screaming now, but I couldn't reverse. The road was too narrow, and there was a steep drop behind us. The group started rocking the bus, gentle at first, like they were testing how much it weighed, seeing how it moved. Then harder, more coordinated. I could feel the whole vehicle swaying as they pushed in rhythm, trying to tip us over. The bus groaned and creaked, tires lifting slightly off the ground on one side. That's when an old woman among them started making noise. Not words, just this high, keening wail that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. The others joined in, one by one, creating this weird harmony that made the windows vibrate. It was like listening to a church choir, if church choirs were made up of people who'd never heard music before but understood the concept perfectly. Betty had enough. She stood up, all 4'11" of her, marched to the emergency exit door, and yanked it open. "Stop that right now!" she hollered in the voice she probably used on her kids 50 years ago. Every single one of them froze. 20 pairs of eyes turned to look at her standing in the doorway of the bus. She looked like what she was, their elder, someone who deserved respect. They stopped rocking the bus and stepped back, giving her space. "Betty, don't!" I called out, but she was already climbing down. This 78-year-old woman in her good shoes and flower print dress, stepping out to face down 20 naked, painted people in the middle of nowhere. She stood there for a moment, looking at them. Then she started humming. Amazing G, race, slow and clear, like she was standing at the front of a church. Her voice carried in the still air, echoing off the trees. The people tilted their heads, listening. One by one, they started humming along. No words, just the melody. But they had it perfect. Their voices blended with hers, creating something beautiful and haunting that gave me chills. Betty walked forward, right through the middle of them. They parted like water, stepping aside but staying close enough to touch her dress, to smell her hair. She made it to the other side of the group and turned back toward the bus. "Come on, folks," she said to us in her normal voice. "They're just confused." I couldn't believe what I was seeing when my other passengers started following her. 11 elderly people climbing out of that bus and walking through a crowd of naked, mud-covered strangers like they were strolling through their own neighborhood. The painted people touched their clothes gently, smelling them, studying the fabric and buttons like they were precious artifacts. One of them, a young woman, maybe 20 years old, started crying. Not the wailing from before. Quiet tears that cut clean tracks through the white mud on her face. She reached for Betty's hand, and Betty took it without hesitation. They walked together, Betty still humming, the young woman making soft sounds that might have been her trying to sing along. The whole group followed us, all 20 of them, walking behind our little procession of senior citizens like we were leading some kind of religious ceremony. They were peaceful now, almost reverent, stepping carefully and keeping their voices low. We walked maybe a quarter mile before the road widened enough for me to turn the bus around. I got everyone back on board, but the painted people didn't leave. They followed us, walking behind the bus as I drove slowly down that dirt road, barefoot on gravel and rocks, never stopping, never falling behind. For 5 miles they followed us until we finally reached the paved road that led back to civilization. At the tree line, they stopped. All of them, like there was an invisible barrier they couldn't cross. They stood there waving as we drove away, some still humming Betty's hymn. I could see them in my mirrors until we rounded the bend. Betty was crying. "They just wanted to be seen," she told me. "Nobody sees them anymore. They're forgotten people." One of my passengers tried to take a picture through the back window, but it came out blurry. Movement and shadows mostly. But you could see their eyes, all those human eyes, watching us leave. Betty died 2 months later, peaceful in her sleep like she'd lived her whole life. At her funeral, I swear I heard humming coming from the trees around the cemetery. That same melody, faint but unmistakable. The retirement home requested a different tour route after that, said the detour had been too stressful for their residents. But sometimes I drive that road alone. I leave food at the spot where we first saw them. Sandwiches, fruit, bottled water. I never see them anymore, but the food's always gone when I come back. And sometimes there are flowers left in exchange. Wild flowers tied together with grass, arranged neat and careful, like someone taught them how. I think they remember her. The old woman who wasn't afraid, who treated them like people instead of monsters. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, still waiting in the woods for someone else to see them, to remind them they're human too. Looking back now, I still don't understand what they were or why they were there. All I know is that Betty saw something in them that the rest of us missed, something that made her brave enough to step off that bus and walk among them like they were her own family. I'm 43 now, still driving tour buses, still taking people up into these mountains to see the leaves change. But I always stick to the main roads these days. Some detours are meant to stay lost. I was 21 when I took the security job at Titan Construction, mainly because I was broke and community college wasn't paying for itself. My supervisor, Rick, handed me a flashlight, a clipboard, and the keys to a beat-up Ford pickup, then told me I'd be watching their newest site up near the Tennessee mountains. Midnight to 6 a.m., $40 a night. Just sit there and make sure nobody walked off with a bulldozer. Easy money, or at least that's what I thought. The site was about 20 minutes outside of town where Titan was clearing old forest to expand some strip mall. Nothing too exciting. Just your typical small-town development pushing deeper into the mountains. They'd already cleared maybe 2 acres and had all the heavy equipment parked in neat rows like sleeping giants. A couple porta potties, a construction trailer that served as the site office, and a little security shack that was basically a glorified phone booth with a heater. The whole place was surrounded by orange mesh fencing, more to keep people out than actually secure anything valuable. My first 3 nights were exactly what you'd expect. I'd park the truck near the gate, set up my camping chair, and burn through podcasts while drinking gas station coffee. The motion sensors would go off every now and then, usually just deer wandering down from the tree line to check out all the commotion we'd brought to their neighborhood. I'd flip on the floodlights, see a couple sets of eyes reflecting back at me from the forest edge, and that would be it. Honestly, it was kind of peaceful. Just me, the mountains, and the sound of absolutely nothing happening. But on my 4th night, things got weird. It started around 2 a.m. The motion sensors kept triggering, but when I'd hit the lights, I couldn't see anything. Not even deer, just empty construction site and that wall of dark trees staring back at me. After the 3rd false alarm in an hour, I figured maybe the sensors were acting up. Old equipment, mountain humidity. Made sense something might be on the fritz. Then I remembered the security monitors in the little shack. The system was pretty basic. Just 4 cameras pointed at different corners of the site, feeding into a grainy black and white monitor that looked like it was from the 90s. I'd never bothered checking it before since I could see most of the site from my truck, but I figured it might help me spot whatever was setting off those sensors. That's when I saw them. 3 people, maybe adults, walking around the construction site, completely naked, covered head to toe in what looked like mud or dirt. At first I thought maybe it was some kind of prank, college kids or locals messing around, but something about the way they moved didn't look right. Too careful, too interested in everything. I watched one of them walk up to the bulldozer and start licking the blade, actually licking it, like he was tasting the metal. Another one had found the diesel exhaust pipe and was sticking his face right up to it, breathing deep like it was fresh mountain air. The 3rd person, a woman, had somehow gotten into the cab of the dozer and was sitting there moving all the controls, but the keys were in my pocket. The machine was completely off. She was making engine noises with her mouth, weird rumbling sounds, and pretending to drive, turning the steering wheel back and forth while she made her little engine impressions. Like a kid playing with a toy, except this was a grown woman covered in mud sitting in a 20-ton bulldozer at 2 in the morning. I hit the floodlights. All 3 of them froze instantly like animals caught in headlights. And when they turned to look at me, their eyes reflected silver, just like deer. But these weren't deer. They were people. I could see that much even from a distance. And they were all smiling. The exact same smile, like someone had taught them how to do it, and they'd all learned the same way. The woman stood up in the bulldozer cab and started dancing. I'm not talking about normal dancing. She was writhing around like there was music playing that only she could hear, bending and twisting in ways that made my stomach hurt to watch. The other 2 joined in, climbing all over the construction equipment, rubbing against it, moving their bodies like they were in love with the machinery. One of the men wrapped his arms around the cement mixer and started crying. Actually crying, tears streaming down his muddy face while he hugged this piece of equipment like it was a long-lost friend. I could hear him making these soft, sobbing sounds even from where I was sitting. Then they found the porta potties. I've never seen people get so excited about anything in my life. They were practically bouncing up and down, taking turns sitting inside, trying to make the thing flush even though it was just a basic pit toilet. When it didn't work, they started making flushing sounds with their mouths, this wet gurgling noise, and laughing like it was the funniest thing they'd ever experienced. That's when I noticed the surveyors had left some spray paint cans by the construction trailer. These people, and I was starting to wonder if they really were people, found those cans and went absolutely insane. They started painting themselves, each other, the machinery, anything they could reach. Most of it was just random patterns and symbols, but I could see them trying to write words too. Backwards letters, broken sentences. Like they understood writing was important but didn't quite know how it worked. On one of the trees they hadn't bulldozed yet, someone had painted "Home was here" in big dripping letters. They built some kind of shrine out of hard hats and safety vests, arranging them in a circle and kneeling around it, making these mumbling sounds that might have been prayers, or might have been something else. One of them found the sandwich I'd left in the security shack and ate it, but then carefully wrapped the crusts back up in the bag and returned it to exactly where I'd left it. They spent the next hour arranging rocks from the forest in the parking spaces we'd marked out. One rock per space, lined up perfectly, like they were assigning them or saving spots for someone. The woman found an orange traffic cone and put it on her head, walking around like she was wearing a crown while the other two bowed to her. They played like this for hours, like kids, except they were clearly adults, just wrong somehow, having the time of their lives with our construction equipment, treating it like the most amazing playground they'd ever discovered. But as soon as the sun started coming up, they got scared. Actually scared, looking around frantically like they'd suddenly remembered something important. They gathered up their little hard hat shrine and ran back into the forest, disappearing into the trees so fast I almost wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. I sat there for the rest of my shift trying to convince myself I'd fallen asleep and dreamed it all. But when I checked the security footage, there it was. All of it. 3 muddy people treating our construction site like their personal amusement park. I showed the footage to Rick the next day. He went white as a sheet, told me to delete it, and then said something I'll never forget. "We don't talk about the forest people, just let them play." When I asked him what the hell that meant, he just shook his head. "They've been here longer than the town. We build around them, not through them." The next night, when I showed up for my shift, there were offerings at the tree line. Food, clothes, even some toys, all arranged in neat little piles just inside the forest. I found out later that Titan had been leaving stuff. For them, some kind of unofficial arrangement to keep the construction moving smoothly. For weeks it went on like that. A silent trade agreement. The forest people would take the offerings and leave painted rocks in exchange, sometimes arranged in patterns that might have meant something or might have just been random, until corporate found out. Some executive from Atlanta came up and threw a fit about wasting company resources on nonsense. Made Rick stop leaving the offerings, said anyone caught feeding the locals would be fired on the spot. That night, every piece of equipment on the site was destroyed. Not vandalized, disassembled. Every bolt, every screw, every piece of machinery taken apart down to its basic components and arranged in perfect geometric patterns across the site. It would have taken a team of mechanics with proper tools hours to do that kind of work, and these people had done it in a single night with their bare hands. I quit the next morning, told Rick I was going back to school full-time and didn't need the job anymore, which was true enough. But the real reason was that I kept thinking about those silver eyes and that synchronized smile, wondering what would happen if they decided they were done playing games. The construction site has been delayed for 3 years now. Every time I drive past it, the equipment is still sitting there in pieces, rusting in neat little piles. The company put up new fencing and hired a different security firm, but I heard they have trouble keeping guards for more than a week or two. Sometimes I wonder if those forest people are still out there, waiting for someone to bring them new toys to play with. But honestly, I try not to think about it too much. Some things are better left alone, especially when they've been in the mountains longer than any of us have been alive. I finished community college and got a job in town, day shift only. And I don't take contracts that involve construction sites anymore, no matter how good the money is.